So from 1985 to 87, a lot of upheaval and change was taking place in ISKCON. During that time, I had moved up to the Bhaktivedanta village. I was running my own business. I lived about 3 miles from the temple itself, but I would go to the programs. I'd give classes. I'd perform artis. It was the temple I went to. But I wasn't involved in all the things going on, especially because that was a more isolated center. It was actually a gurukula for the children. And even though I wasn't a teacher and part of that, I had to get out of the smog. The smog in LA was very much affecting me. And so that's one reason why I went there. Rameshwar and Bhagawan both resigned and left ISKCON later in 1986. After Rameshwar resigned as GBC and left ISKCON, that Bhaktivedanta village center where I was, it could no longer maintain its mortgage payments, and the temple and the school was forced to close, and the property was foreclosed on. At that time, I moved back to the LA temple, and that was in 1987. By then, the Ritvik Acharya system, by then the Ritvik Acharya issue had already begun to take shape. But in my immediate circle of friends at that time in LA, none of those devotees were involved in any of that. So I didn't get involved at that time. While in LA, I was asked to become the temple president of several different temples. And I would have taken up the offer. But I had entered a business partnership with Gopal Bhatta. And even though that business was winding down, I had to stay in LA for a while longer as we basically dissolved that business. But later in 1987, I developed serious health issues. I had grown up in Southern California, and I had suffered from respiratory problems caused by the air pollution since before I was a teenager. By late 1987, to early 1988, my condition became acute. The lining of my nose had become constantly wet with blood. My lungs ached. They were filling up with liquid. I was struggling to breathe. And I was becoming more and more weak. At times, I could hardly get up out of bed. I didn't go to a doctor, a Western doctor, because I just didn't believe in Western medicine at that time. I was into herbs and herbal medicine. Self-treatment, basically, but I knew that if I wouldn't live much longer if I remained in the smog. I found that whenever I took a trip out of the smog basin of Southern California, even if it was just to Malibu by the coast or Santa Barbara a little bit further up, my symptoms would start to subside within hours. Yet 30 minutes back in the smog of Los Angeles Valley, all the symptoms would reappear. Lungs would start gurgling and filling up with liquid. My nose would turn raw inside. So it became obvious I had to get out of the LA smog. I had to find another rural place to live. The first choice would have been to find an ISKCON rural farming center. But I had no direct, devotee friends in any of those farming communities that I knew of. And in 1988, the only reports that I was hearing at the time were not good. We heard that several farm communities were on the brink of closing. Devotees who had lived in some of those communities for many years were selling their houses and forced to leave. All I heard about the ISKCON farm communities at that time was negative. But I couldn't live in the city, in the smog anymore. I'd surely die if I didn't get out. My brother lived in Oregon. And I took a trip up to see him, and on the way up, I passed through Redding, California. The air near Redding and Mount Shasta in Northern California was like medicine to my lungs. Got the microphone there, right? It was like medicine to my lungs, and I had to take immediate action to recover my health, so I wound up buying a place up in the mountains, 45 minutes out of Redding, California, and lived with my wife far, far away from any other ISKCON devotees for the next 4.5 years, till the end of 1992. After moving there, I read that the air quality in that part of California, Northern California, was among the cleanest in all of North America, at least at that time. Well, there I held Sunday programs. I invited people, and they drove up a 45-minute drive from Redding to just a few came to our programs. But we did prashadam distribution. We did distributing Srila Prabhupada's books. I hadn't left ISKCON. I was running my own center basically, but small, but I hadn't left ISKCON. That wasn't why I moved there. I moved there only because of my health. It was 100% health related. But a lot of devotees in ISKCON thought that I had left ISKCON because at that time, a lot of Srila Prabhupada's disciples were leaving. The Zonal Acarya debacle, there was such a heavy fallout that so many devotees they were either leaving, plus the murderous Lochan, so many things had been going on. And devotees looked and they thought they considered the GBC was just totally mismanaging and that the whole ISKCON was just going off course. So many devotees, they either fled because they were supporting the Ritvik Ras path, or they fled to take shelter of Srila Prabhupada's godbrother, Srila Rasik Sridhar Maharaj. And this is a whole other story all on its own about Srila Rasik Sridhar Maharaj. And it does have direct relevancy to this issue. However, for the sake of keeping this part of the presentation focused and somewhat manageable, I'll only mention this briefly here. More detail will be covered in the chronological timeline section. But in brief, the GBC had been going to see Srila Sridhar Maharaj since 1978. And in fact, the Zonal Acharya system and much of the early Guru system that the GBC set up was based entirely on the advice given by Srila Sridhar Maharaj. I will give explanations in the chronological time too, actually later on in my personal story, why this was and how this came about. But from 1978 to 1982, and even beyond, many members of the GBC, including the new gurus, regularly sought out the guidance of Sridhar Maharaj. But again, there was an effort made by the GBC and the gurus to keep that relationship secret. The problem was that Srila Sridhar was an acting guru himself. The new gurus were afraid that if it became known that the ISKCON's new gurus were seeking the guidance of a senior Vaishnav who himself accepted his own disciples, that the new members coming to ISKCON would go and actually, why would they be accepting the new ISKCON gurus? They might as well go to the senior Vaishnav and take his shelter directly, take initiation from him directly, because ISKCON's gurus were going to him and seeking his guidance, so why not just go directly to Sridhar? So for this reason, the new gurus and the GBC tried to keep the relationship they were having with Sridhar secret. But in 1982, Jayatirtha broke that policy of secrecy. And it was, as I said, this is a whole other story, all of it on its own, and it will be covered more in the chronological timeline. But by 1985, a number of Prabhupada disciples were disturbed by the way the GBC was, in their view, mismanaging ISKCON. The gurus had become egotistical tyrants. Some exhibited outright criminal behavior. Many could see the gurus were not actually fit or qualified. They saw, however, in Srila Sridhar Maharaj, a much needed fatherly figure, a spiritual uncle, as he was the godbrother of Srila Prabhupada. And so those devotees sought his association, his advice, and some even sought his shelter. They were seeking refuge from the storm and the madness that had been taking place in ISKCON. Anyway, that was also going on, although Sridhar departed this world in 1988. His leaving created another upheaval in his camp as well. But for me, as I said, by Krishna's arrangement, I had avoided all of this. And from 1988 to 1993, my wife and I were living on our own as I was recovering my health up in the mountains of Northern California.